They came to take everything she had left, but the most dangerous man in the city looked her straight in the eye and said something that silenced the entire street. "You can keep the house. Marry me. In a year." This is the story of a woman thrown into the criminal underworld, a man armed with weapons instead of a heart, and a marriage contract that becomes more dangerous than any bullet. If you're watching this video, please like and comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has come. And don't go anywhere, because this is just the beginning. The rain came in sideways off Black Ridge Harbor, cold and indifferent, the kind that soaked through a coat before a person even realized they were wet. It hit the old Victorian on Carver Street like it had a grudge, drumming against the rotted gutters, pooling in the cracked driveway, turning the front yard into something that looked like grief made visible. Sienna Hartwell stood on the porch and watched a man in a city uniform nail a yellow notice to the front gate. She didn't say anything. She'd run out of things to say 3 weeks ago, somewhere between the bank's final letter and the phone call from her father's lawyer explaining that the estate, such as it was, had been legally dissolved. She was 24 years old and she was watching strangers attach paper to the gate her father had painted himself 11 years ago on a summer afternoon when she'd handed him brushes and he'd told her this house would always be hers. Her father was 6 months in the ground. The promise had lasted about as long. Behind her, inside the house, her mother was in the kitchen doing what she'd been doing for 3 weeks, moving things around without purpose, picking up cups and setting them down in the same place, talking in a low voice to herself, or maybe to a version of her husband that only she could still access. And Marcus, Sienna's younger brother, 18 and hollow-eyed, was sitting on the stairs with his knees pulled to his chest, staring at the front door like it might open and bring something good inside. It didn't. What came instead was the sound of engines. Not one engine, multiple. The specific sound of vehicles built for intimidation rather than economy. A low, swallowing rumble that Sienna felt in her back teeth before she actually heard it. She turned toward the street. 3 black SUVs rolled onto Carver Street in formation, unhurried, the way things move when they already know the outcome. They parked in a line along the curb with mechanical precision. The rain ran in sheets off their tinted windows. Neighbors appeared. That was the thing about this neighborhood. People materialized at door frames and parted curtains when anything disrupted the ordinary rhythm of the street. An old woman 3 houses down paused with her hands inside her coat. A man walking his dog stopped walking. Somebody from across the street stood on their porch with a phone already raised. Everyone seemed to understand who these cars belonged to before the doors even opened. The driver's side door of the middle SUV opened first. A man stepped out and opened the rear door. Then Damien Vescari stood in the rain on Carver Street like he was surveying something he'd already decided to purchase. Sienna had seen his photograph exactly once, in a newspaper story that had been printed 2 years ago about organized crime on the East Coast, accompanied by a photo taken from a distance that made him look blurred and abstract. The newspaper hadn't been able to get closer. Nobody who wanted to stay employed got closer to Damien Vescari without his permission. In person, he was different from what she'd constructed in her mind from that photograph, and the things people said about him in the city. He was taller, younger, maybe mid-30s, though something in the set of his jaw suggested he'd carried weight that aged people faster than birthdays did. He wore a dark wool coat that the rain didn't seem to touch somehow, or maybe it touched him, and he simply didn't react to it. His face was sharp at the angles, not handsome in any conventional decorative way, but the kind of face that made a person understand immediately that beauty was irrelevant in the context of the rest of him. He stood at the gate and read the yellow foreclosure notice with the same expression he might have used to read a takeout menu. Then his eyes moved to the porch, to Sienna. She didn't step back. She would be honest with herself later about how badly part of her wanted to, how her body registered him as something to move away from before the brain had formed a conscious thought. But she'd been standing on this porch watching things get taken from her family for weeks, and she was done retreating on her own property. He studied her for a moment, then he walked up the driveway. His men stayed by the cars. That was notable. She registered it without quite knowing what to do with it. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, close enough that she could see the rain on his shoulders, on the sharp line of his collar. He looked up at her, and the look was not aggressive. not predatory. Something stranger than either of those things. Measuring, like he was calculating something she didn't have the variables for. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was level, quiet enough that it shouldn't have carried over the rain, but it did. "Whatever you're here to collect," she said, "the lawyers can arrange a time." Something shifted at the edge of his mouth. Not quite a smile, not amusement exactly. More like acknowledgement. The way a person looks when something surprises them in a minor way and they decide to file it. "I'm not here to collect anything," he said. "Then what are you here for?" She didn't phrase it as a question. She didn't have the energy left to make her voice go up at the end of sentences. He looked at the foreclosure notice on the gate, then back at her. "You can keep the house," he said. "Marry me for 1 year." The rain hit the porch roof. Somewhere down the street, a car door closed. Sienna was aware, in a strange, dissociated way, of the complete silence that had fallen over the people watching from their doorways and windows. That particular human stillness, when a neighborhood collectively understands it, is witnessing something it will be describing for years. She stared at Damien Vescari and said nothing for a long moment, because there was no sentence in her vocabulary that applied to what had just been said to her. "I don't know who you think I am," she said finally. "Sienna Ann Hartwell," he said, without hesitation. "Graduated top of her class at Aldridge University, management and finance. Declined 2 job offers from corporate consulting firms last year to stay and care for her father during his illness. Brother, Marcus, 18, enrolled at City Technical, but attendance has dropped significantly in the last 6 months. Mother, Eleanor, 56, currently on a fixed income that will cover roughly 4 months of rental costs once this property is sold at foreclosure auction." He paused. "I know who you are." She felt something cold that had nothing to do with the rain. "That's not an answer," she said. "That's a file." "It is," he agreed. "Why do you have a file on me?" "Because I do my research before I make an offer." She looked at him for a long moment, his hands in his coat pockets, rain on his collar, his face doing the thing where it gave away almost nothing. She wanted to say something that would end this conversation and make him and his cars leave. She ran through several options in her mind and discarded all of them, because she was also running a different calculation underneath the surface of this conversation. The kind of ugly arithmetic that comes from weeks of watching a financial crisis eat through a family from the inside out. The mortgage was 5 months overdue. The secondary lenders her father had apparently borrowed from, men whose names Sienna had only discovered existed after the funeral, buried in paperwork she'd had to teach herself to read, had made it clear through letters that became progressively less polite that they expected a different kind of repayment. Marcus had come home twice in the last month with bruises he'd explained away with stories about falling. She knew what the bruises were. She knew what happened to families who couldn't pay men like that. She wasn't sure yet whether Damien Vescari was better or worse than those men. But she was standing here doing the math. "Come inside," she said. Her mother looked up when they walked through the door, and the thing that crossed Eleanor Hartwell's face when she saw Damien Vescari was not the fear Sienna expected. It was something more exhausted than fear, the expression of a woman who had already processed so many bad things that she'd moved past the stage of acute reaction. "Mom," Sienna said, "can you take Marcus upstairs?" Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long beat. Then she looked at the man standing in her entryway. Then she went to the stairs without a word, put her hand on Marcus's shoulder, and steered him upward. Marcus twisted to look back at Damien over his shoulder. Damien didn't acknowledge the look. Sienna brought him into the front room, a room that had once been well kept, still presentable in a tired way, with the furniture that hadn't been sold yet and the empty spaces on the walls where things had been sold. She didn't offer him coffee. She didn't invite him to sit. She stood in the middle of the room and turned to face him. "Talk," she said. He sat anyway, in the armchair by the window, with the manner of someone who sits wherever they want to sit and has never encountered a room that felt unwelcoming. He wasn't rude about it. He wasn't performing dominance. He simply had a particular relationship with physical space that most people didn't have. "1 year," he said. "Public appearances when required. A wedding that will be real in the legal sense. An address here, though you'll have accommodations available at my residence. Your family's existing debt, including the informal ones, cleared within 72 hours. A monthly living allowance for your mother and brother. Marcus's tuition reinstated. He paused. At the end of the year, a settlement that will make all of this permanent. Sienna crossed her arms. Why? I have reasons. That's not an answer either. He looked at her directly. I'm a man who operates in environments where reputation and perceived stability are relevant factors. A marriage produces certain effects. Certain conversations stop. Certain assumptions change. He said it without decoration, the way a person describes weather. I need those effects for the next 12 months. So you need a prop. I need a partner who can conduct herself intelligently in complicated rooms and won't fall apart under pressure. He said it without inflection. You're not a prop. Prop implies passive. I don't have use for passive. She studied him. The rain on the window behind him made the light move across his face in a way that made him look for just a moment like something being projected rather than something real. She pushed the thought away. What else? She said. Something shifted in his expression. Barely. A fractional thing. What do you mean? You're giving me a list of things I get. What's on the list of things you expect? All of it, not the summary. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone caught off guard, more the silence of someone deciding whether to recalibrate. Complete discretion about what you see and hear, he said. No contact with press, law enforcement, or anyone outside the arrangement regarding my activities. Attendance at functions I determine necessary. No personal relationships that would generate public complications. He paused. Civility, in private. What does civility mean to you? It means we don't make each other's lives harder than they already are. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Marcus's bruises. She thought about her mother moving cups around in the kitchen. She thought about the yellow notice on the front gate and the men who had been sending increasingly specific letters about what they would do to recover their money. She thought about what her father would say. Her father was dead, and the men who'd made him dead were still sending letters. I have conditions, she said. Go ahead. Marcus stays out of it entirely. Whatever world you live in, he doesn't touch it. Not peripherally, not incidentally. He's not part of this. Agreed. If at any point I determine that remaining in this arrangement creates genuine danger for my mother or my brother, the contract ends without penalty. He considered this. Define genuine danger. I'll know it when I see it. She expected pushback. He nodded, once. Agreed. And I want it in writing, all of it, drawn up by a lawyer I choose, not yours. You can use any attorney you want. I'd recommend Marcus Brell at Fortner & Associates. He's handled sensitive arrangements before and he's bound by privilege he takes seriously. But that's a recommendation, not a requirement. She filed the name. Is there anything else you haven't told me? He held her gaze. There are things about my situation that you'll become aware of over time. I won't pretend otherwise. But nothing I've said is false. That's not the same as telling me everything. No, he said, without any attempt to deny it. It's not. She looked at the empty space on the wall where a painting had been. Her father had bought it at a street fair the year she turned 15, an ugly harbor scene with colors that didn't match. And he'd loved it unreasonably, and she'd sold it for $140 to cover a utility bill. I need until tomorrow morning, she said. You have until tomorrow morning, he said, and stood. But she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the folder she'd assembled over 3 months. Bank notices, legal letters, the names of the informal creditors written in her own handwriting on a yellow legal pad. And she went through every number again, the way she'd gone through them 100 times before, looking for a calculation she'd missed that changed the outcome. There wasn't one. At 2 a.m, Marcus came downstairs and found her at the table. He looked at her face and then at the folder and then back at her face. And the thing about Marcus was that he was 18 and he looked younger than that, still soft around the jaw in a way that reminded her of what he'd looked like at 11. And she was very aware of the bruising along his left cheekbone that he'd explained as a handball injury. Who was that man? Marcus said. Someone with a proposal. What kind of proposal? She looked at her brother. She thought about all the ways to answer that question and arrived at the same one she always arrived at with Marcus, which was something close to the truth. The kind that might fix things, she said. He sat down across from her. Sienna, I know what I'm doing. You don't know anything about him. I know enough. Marcus leaned forward, his forearms on the table. People don't just show up and fix things. Not people like that. Not without wanting something back that's worse than what they're giving. She looked at her brother, really looked at him, at the circles under his eyes and the way he held himself like someone bracing against something. And she said quietly, I know that too. Neither of them said anything for a while. If I do this, she said, you finish school. You don't go anywhere near the people who've been… She stopped. You stay away from them. Marcus's jaw tightened. They'll know something changed. Then let them know, as long as they know it while staying away from you. He looked down at the table. What about you? I'll be fine. That's what Dad used to say. The sentence landed quietly, and neither of them looked at each other for a moment. Dad kept things from us, Sienna said, to protect us. And it didn't protect us. I'm not doing that. I'm telling you what I'm going to do and why. You can be angry about it. I'm not angry, Marcus said. I'm scared. Me too, she said. Now go to bed. At 7:45 the next morning, Sienna called the number on the card Damien had left. A plain card, no company name, just a phone number in small print. And when the call connected and he said only, yes, she said, I'll do it. We need to discuss the timeline. There was a silence on the line. Not a surprise silence. More like a silence that had already made room for this answer. I'll send a car at 10, he said. The car arrived at 9:58. The offices where they met with the attorney, Marcus Brell, occupied the 14th floor of a building in the financial district that smelled like climate-controlled air and the particular kind of quiet that only money could buy. Brell was 60-something, precise, and had the demeanor of a man who had witnessed a large number of unusual arrangements and had made peace with his professional circumstances. The contract was 42 pages. Sienna read all 42 of them. Damien sat across the conference table and worked through emails on his phone without apparent impatience, though she noticed, peripherally, that he was watching her more than his phone. She didn't acknowledge this. On page 31, she found a clause she didn't like. She crossed it out and wrote a revised version in the margin. Brell looked at her revision, then he looked at Damien. Damien looked at the margin notes for a moment. Fine, he said. She found 2 more issues. Both were revised in her favor. Brell made the changes without comment. By 11:45, they had both signed. Brell notarized. The rain outside the 14th floor windows had finally stopped, and the harbor below was silver and still. There's one more thing, Damien said as they were leaving. She turned. The wedding, he said. I'd like it within the week. Small, legal, private. It needs to be real. Legal record. Within the week, she repeated. Is that a problem? She thought about it. No, but I want to keep my name. Hartwell, professionally. He held her gaze. That's fine. They rode the elevator down in silence. In the lobby, his driver was waiting. Outside, the harbor city glittered in the thin autumn sunlight in a way that looked almost like promise. She told herself it wasn't. What it was, she decided, as she got into the car and felt it pull away from the curb, was a transaction. A precise, documented transaction between 2 people who both knew the price and had signed anyway. That was all. That was all it needed to be. The wedding was on a Thursday, in a room at City Hall that smelled like old paper and heating vents, with Brell as witness and a clerk who'd seen enough unusual pairs to register no surprise. Sienna wore a dark gray dress she'd had for 3 years because she refused to buy anything new for something that wasn't real. And then she stood in front of a government official and said the words that made it legally real anyway. Damien's hand was warm when he took hers. She hadn't expected that. She'd constructed him, over the preceding days, as somehow ambient temperature, a man who existed at the same degree as the climate around him. His hand was warm and his grip was brief and certain, and she made herself stop noticing either of those things immediately. When it was done, they walked out into the cold afternoon. A photographer appeared. Someone from Damien's operation, she understood, there to document the event for whatever purposes he needed it documented. Smile, Damien said quietly, beside her, not looking at her. This isn't part of the contract, she said, equally quiet. Call it a professional courtesy. She smiled, thin and controlled, at the camera. By 3 o'clock, she was back at Carver Street, standing in the front room that no longer had a foreclosure notice on the gate outside, watching her mother move around the kitchen with something that looked, fractionally, like less weight than it had the day before. By 4 o'clock, her phone rang. It was Marcus. The men who came to the house, he said without introduction. They came by the school today. Different ones. Said the debt was canceled. Said to... He paused. Said to tell you your husband had taken care of it. The word husband sat in the sentence like something foreign. Okay, she said. Sienna. His voice was careful. What did you actually get into? She looked out the window at the gray harbor in the distance. I'm working on figuring that out, she said. That night, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. A contact she would later learn was Damien's personal line, distinct from the number on the card. There's an event Friday evening, charity gala at the Callaway. I'll send details. Wear something that suggests you belong there. She stared at the message. She typed back, I always belong wherever I go. There was a pause that lasted several seconds. Then, good. She set the phone down and looked at the ceiling of the room she'd grown up in and thought about what she'd just done. The clean, contractual, logical things she'd done to save her family. And she was almost certain, lying there in the dark, that she had it under control. She was almost certain, but something in the way the house sounded different tonight, quieter, like even the building understood the ground had shifted, made her think that almost certain was a long way from the other kind. Friday was 3 days away. She had no idea that by the end of it, someone was going to try to put both of them in the ground. The Callaway Hotel occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian Tower, 42 stories above Blackridge Harbor, and on Friday evening it was lit up against the dark sky like something that wanted to be seen from everywhere at once. Black cars queued along the front entrance. Women in floor-length dresses moved through the lobby in a current of expensive scent and practiced laughter. Men in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent stood in clusters near the bar and spoke in the measured tones of people accustomed to being listened to. Sienna stepped out of the car and felt the cold hit her face, and for exactly 3 seconds she let herself register what she was walking into, and then she put it away. The dress was black, simple, long, with a structure to it that said she hadn't borrowed it. She'd bought it the previous afternoon with money from the first installment Damien's lawyer had transferred. She'd looked at the balance in her account for a long time before she'd spent any of it, the way you look at something that shouldn't be there. Then she'd spent a specific and controlled amount and come home and hung the dress on the back of the door and told herself it was a uniform. Damien was waiting at the entrance. He looked at her once, briefly, the way a person looks at something they've been told to assess. Not with anything personal in it, or at least not with anything he let surface. And then he said, "You're on time," and offered his arm. "I'm always on time," she said, and took it. His arm under her hand was solid and unhelpful in the sense that it gave her nothing to read. They walked into the lobby together, and immediately the atmosphere changed around them. She felt it rather than saw it, the slight reorientation of attention, the way conversations paused at the edge of their arrival. People looked at Damien the way people look at something they're not entirely sure how to categorize, with respect that had fear inside it. Then they looked at her, and she watched them try to calculate what she was. She kept her face pleasant and her posture straight and gave them nothing to calculate with. They were met inside by a man she hadn't seen before, late 40s, wide in the shoulders, with a face that had been rearranged at some point and had healed in a way that made its original configuration unclear. He fell into step beside Damien with the ease of someone who spent most of his time in that exact position. "Victor," Damien said without preamble. "My wife." Victor Kane. She filed the name. He turned to her, and his smile was the practiced kind, wide enough to look genuine, careful enough to reveal nothing. "Mrs. Vescari, it's a pleasure." "Hartwell Vescari," she said. "And likewise." Something moved behind his eyes. It was gone before she could name it. "The Aldridge Group is at table 6, Victor said to Damien, his voice dropping half a register. Mercer's already into his second drink. The councilman arrived 20 minutes ago. He's nervous. He's always nervous, Damien said. Tonight he's got a reason to be. Damien said nothing to this. They moved deeper into the room. The gala was a machine for money and proximity, a charity event that raised funds for something to do with the city's waterfront restoration. Though Sienna understood within the first 40 minutes that the waterfront was largely decorative, and the real business of the evening was the conversations happening at the margins, at the bar, in the narrow spaces between tables where men leaned toward each other and exchanged sentences that had weight. She was good at rooms. She'd known this about herself since college. The ability to track multiple conversations simultaneously, to read the temperature of a dynamic from across a space, to say exactly enough and not one word more. What she hadn't known, until tonight, was how that skill felt when it was being put to actual use, as opposed to a networking event or a faculty reception. It felt like being very awake. Damien moved through the room the way water moves around an object, not by forcing anything, but by existing in a way that made everything else reroute. She stayed beside him and said what was required and watched people's faces when they thought she wasn't watching, and she started assembling a map. The councilman at table 9 was sweating too much for the temperature of the room. A man introduced to her as a regional developer named Paul Oates kept his eyes too long on Damien's face when Damien spoke, the specific look of someone trying to determine whether they've been found out. A woman, beautiful, late 30s, wearing something architectural in dark green, stood near the bar for 90 minutes and spoke to 4 different men in 4 different conversations, and left each one of them looking unsettled. Sienna watched her and thought, she's working. She didn't know yet what that meant in this context. At some point, the second hour, when the formal dinner had been cleared and the dancing had started and the room had loosened with alcohol and music, Damien leaned slightly toward her and said quietly at her ear, "The woman in green at the bar. Don't look directly. What do you make of her?" Sienna didn't look directly. "She's extracting things from those conversations. Information. She's got a method. Starts with something personal, gets the other person talking about themselves, pivots to whatever she actually wanted." Silence beside her for a moment. "You picked that up," he said. "It's not hard to pick up. Most people in this room haven't. Most people in this room are busy performing at each other," she said. Another pause. Then, "Her name is Lena Price. She works for a man named Garrett Foss. He runs a competing operation out of the Northern Corridor. She's been at 3 events in the last 6 weeks. Is she dangerous?" "Everyone in this room is dangerous," he said straightforwardly. "That's what this room is." She turned her head just slightly to look at him and found that he was already looking at her, and for a moment the distance between them was different from what it had been. Then someone approached from the left, and the moment sealed over, and he turned to greet a man with gray hair and a politician's handshake, and Sienna stood beside him and smiled and put the moment in a folder she wasn't going to open. The problem started at 11:47. She was standing near the windows, the floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the harbor 42 stories below. With a glass of water she'd been nursing for an hour, watching the city lights reflect on the dark water, when Victor Kane appeared at her elbow. He stood beside her and looked out at the view and said, "You're handling this well." "Thanks," she said. "The room, the people, it can be a lot for someone new to it." "I'm managing." He nodded slowly. The pleasant smile was still there, wide and practiced. She noticed that his eyes didn't fully match his mouth, not in the specific, dramatic way of cartoons, but in the subtle way that came from years of manufacturing and expression that the muscles around it hadn't entirely agreed to. "How much did he tell you?" Victor said. "Before you signed." She looked at him. "That's an interesting question to ask. Just curious about how he's handling the arrangement, making sure you're comfortable with what you've gotten into." "I'm comfortable." "Good." He sipped his drink. "It's a complicated world to step into. There are things about Damien's situation, the current dynamics, that can be surprising. If there's ever anything you want to understand better." He paused. "I've been with him a long time. There are things I could clarify." She looked at the harbor. She looked at Victor Kane. She looked at the careful architecture of what he'd just done. The concern layered over the offer, layered over the implication that there were things she should want clarified. Things she didn't yet know, things he could provide access to. That's generous, she said. I'll keep it in mind. He smiled again and moved away, and she tracked him across the room without appearing to, watching him reach Damien and say something at his ear and then drift toward the bar. And she thought about the thing his face had done when she'd corrected the name, the thing that had been gone before she could name it. She thought she could name it now. It was assessment. Nuts. She told Damien in the car on the way home. She described the conversation precisely, without interpretation, and let him draw his own conclusions first. He listened with his face turned toward the window, his jaw set in the way she was starting to recognize as thought rather than anger. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What did you say when he offered to clarify things? He said. That I'd keep it in mind. Good. Is he a problem? Damien turned from the window. The car's interior was dark and the passing streetlights caught the angles of his face in intervals. Victor's been with me 11 years. He's the reason I have the infrastructure I have. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him. Is there a reason you'd be keeping something like that to yourself? There are reasons I keep most things to myself. That's a pattern, not a reason. His eyes moved to her face, and again there was that quality of something recalibrating, the fractional adjustment. You have a way of getting to the direct question fast. I have a limited tolerance for people talking around the point. That'll be useful, he said, and occasionally inconvenient. Which one is it right now? He held her gaze for a moment longer. Both, he said, and turned back to the window, and didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive. But she'd been in the Vescari residence for 4 days before something broke. The residence was a building within a building, a converted floor in a tower near the waterfront, with the kind of security that made itself felt without being visible, the way certain rooms feel enclosed without any apparent reason. She had her own suite, its own entrance from the internal corridor, its own locks that she controlled. This had been in the contract. It felt important now in a different way than it had felt when she'd negotiated it. She was in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, early, still dark outside, the harbor just starting to show gray light, when Damien came in from whatever he'd been doing that had kept him up all night. She could tell from the way he moved, controlled as always, but the control working harder. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His collar was open. She put coffee in front of him without being asked and said nothing. He looked at it, then at her. Victor met with someone last week, he said without introduction. I didn't know about it. One of Foss's lieutenants. I found out this morning. She sat down across from him. You trust this information. The source, yes. What do you need to know? He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and looked at the surface of it like it might have something to tell him. Whether it was operational or personal, whether he was freelancing or building something. And you can't ask him directly. Not yet. Because if you ask him directly and you're wrong about what it means, you've shown your hand to the person who's supposed to be watching your back. He looked up. Yes. She understood sitting there in the gray morning light that she was being trusted with something. Not because he decided to trust her necessarily, more because the situation had run out of other options and she was here and she demonstrated over the last 4 days that she processed information without leaking it. It wasn't personal trust. It was functional trust. She knew the difference. You're watching him, she said. Carefully. Is there anyone else you'd be watching? He studied her. Why? Because a single point of concern is usually not a single point. In my experience, when you find one problem in a system, you look around it, not just at it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, there are people I'm less certain of than I was a month ago. How many? 3. Aside from Victor. She looked at him. The harbor was getting lighter behind him. That's a significant number. Yes, he said. It is. She picked up her own coffee. She thought about systems, financial ones, the kind she'd studied, the kind her father had navigated badly enough to destroy the family. The way a single bad actor in a system wasn't the danger. The danger was the damage they did while you were still deciding if they were real. If someone inside your organization is actively working against you, she said, you're already behind. The question is how far behind. He looked at her across the table for a moment, and there was something in his face she couldn't quite label. Not gratitude, not surprise. More like recognition, the way you look when something confirms a thing you'd already half decided. Yes, he said quietly. That's exactly the question. The next 3 days had a specific texture. She understood it in retrospect, the way the pressure inside the building felt higher, more contained, the way Damien's men moved with a slight edge of deliberateness that had a reason underneath it. She attended 2 functions with him and read the room at both. She reported back and he listened and occasionally asked precise follow-up questions and occasionally said nothing at all, and the operational rhythm of the arrangement developed a groove she hadn't anticipated. She also noticed Victor watching her. Not constantly, not obviously. The kind of watching that happened at the periphery of rooms, the kind that stopped before it became staring. She said nothing to Damien about it immediately because she wanted to collect more data before she made a claim. She had enough of her father's analytical instincts to understand that a claim made too early on insufficient data was worse than no claim at all. On the 3rd night, a Wednesday, no event, the building quiet past midnight, she went to the kitchen for water and found one of Damien's men, a young one named Reyes, standing in the corridor outside her suite, looking like he'd drawn a short straw. Mr. Viscari wants to know if you're available, Reyes said. Now, she said. Yes, ma'am. She pulled on a sweater over her sleep clothes and followed him through the internal corridor to the main workspace, a room she'd been in 3 times, high-ceilinged with screens on one wall and a table that was currently covered in documents and photographs and what looked like printed communications. Damien was there. So were 2 men she knew by sight, Croft and Benner, senior in whatever the hierarchy was. Victor was not there. I need you to look at something, Damien said when she came in. No apology for the hour. She didn't need one. She went to the table. The photographs were surveillance images, public spaces, restaurants, a parking structure. In several of them, Victor Kane was visible. In one of them, he was sitting across from a man in a gray jacket whose face was partially obscured. In another, clear, the man's face was visible. Do you know him? Damien said. She studied the face. No. Who is he? His name is Curtis Webb. He works for a federal organized crime task force. The room was very quiet. She looked at the photograph. She looked at Victor in the photograph. His body language relaxed, his posture open, the posture of a man in a comfortable conversation. Then she looked at Damien. How long? She said. We don't know. Do you have anything beyond the meetings? Not yet. She pulled one of the photographs closer and looked at it. The body language in this one is different from this one, she said, pointing. Here, Kane is in the position of someone receiving. Here, he's in the position of someone delivering. That matters. It tells you the direction of information flow at that particular meeting. Croft and Benner looked at each other. Damien did not look away from her. How do you know that? He said. I studied behavioral communication as part of my degree. I did a focus on negotiation analysis. She straightened. I'm not an expert, but the body language is clear enough that I don't need to be. Damien looked at her for a long moment. If Victor is feeding information to a federal task force, she said, then everything you've said or done in his presence in the last... How long has he had access? 11 years, Damien said, and the word came out with something under it, something she recognized as old and heavy and not for public display. Then the exposure is potentially significant, she said. You need to know exactly what he knows before you move. Damien turned to the window. He stood there with his back to the room for a moment, and she watched the set of his shoulders, the way they held without releasing, and she understood for the first time something about him that the contract hadn't accounted for. That the man who had shown up on her porch with his files and his certainty and his black cars was currently carrying a weight that had no external expression because he had no place to put it. That was when his phone rang. He picked it up, said nothing for the first 3 seconds, just listened. Then his jaw did the thing it did when something was working to stay controlled. Where? He said. A pause. Don't move him, he said. I'm coming. He ended the call and looked at Sienna, and the look on his face was the first time she'd seen the structure of him come close to cracking. Marcus, he said, your brother. The floor under her shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the building. "What?" she said, and her voice came out in a register she didn't recognize. "He didn't come home from school this afternoon. His roommate called your mother an hour ago. Your mother's been trying to reach you. Your phone was off." He was already moving. "Someone has him, Sienna, and they left a message. They want me to turn myself over to Curtis Webb by Friday morning." He paused at the door and looked back at her, and his face was doing something she'd never seen it do, carrying the weight on the outside just for a moment, just for her. "Or they said they'll—" She was already across the room. "I'm coming with you," she said, and it was not a question, and she was not waiting for an answer, and the version of herself that had stood on the porch 3 weeks ago watching strangers nail paper to the gate was something she'd stepped out of entirely, and the floor had shifted and it wasn't shifting back. And there was no version of this moment in which she stood still and waited to be protected. And Damien looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him step aside and let her through the door first. The car moved through Blackridge like something hunting, cutting red lights at intersections where Damien's driver seemed to have a private understanding with the city's infrastructure. Sienna sat in the back seat with her hands flat on her thighs and her breathing deliberate. In through the nose, out slow, the mechanical kind of breathing that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with not coming apart before she had information to act on. Damien was on the phone. 3 calls in the first 6 minutes, each one short, each one in a register she was learning to read. The clipped economy of a man deploying people rather than talking to them. Between calls, he said nothing. She didn't ask questions. Questions right now would only interrupt a process that needed to move faster than conversation. The city scrolled past the windows. The harbor district, the industrial corridor east of the waterfront, streets that got narrower and less lit as they went. She thought about Marcus on the stairs at Carver Street with his knees pulled to his chest. She thought about the bruises he'd explained away. She thought about the fact that those bruises had been a warning she'd understood and acted on, married a crime lord to make them stop. And somehow the warning had found another shape and landed anyway. The car stopped at a building near the edge of the port district. Old concrete, industrial, the kind of structure that had stopped being anything official a decade ago and had since become something else. Damien was out of the car before it fully stopped. Inside, 2 men Sienna didn't know were standing in a corridor. One of them handed Damien a phone. He looked at the screen. A message, text. She couldn't see the content. And his face did something brief and controlled that she'd learned meant the situation was worse than the last update. He showed her the phones. The message was a photograph. Marcus, sitting in a chair, wrists bound with zip ties, a strip of packing tape across his mouth. His eyes were open and present. Not glazed, not indicating physical harm yet, just the expression of someone trying very hard to hold themselves together and partway succeeding. Beside the photograph, a single line of text. Friday, 8 a.m. Webb's direct line is attached. Call it, or we send you something worse. Sienna stared at the photograph for 4 seconds. She handed the phone back. "Is this Webb himself?" she said. "Or is this someone using Webb as leverage?" Damien looked at her. "Because if Webb is actually running this," she said, "then this is a federal operation using a civilian as bait, which puts it in one category. If someone else is running this and using Webb as the mechanism, that's a different category entirely." "Why does the distinction matter right now?" one of the men in the corridor said. Not hostile, more like genuinely asking. "Because it determines whether Marcus is in danger from the people holding him, or just uncomfortable," she said. "Federal operatives don't harm civilians they're using as leverage. It exposes the operation. But if this is someone else, someone using the federal angle as cover, then Marcus is in real danger because those people don't have the same constraints." Damien looked at her for a moment. Then he said to the men, "Get Croft on the line. Tell him I need Webb's movements from the last 72 hours cross-referenced with—" He paused and looked at her again. "The calls to Webb. Find out if any of them originated from within our network." He was already thinking what she was thinking. She followed him deeper into the building. "Tika." The room they set up in had the provisional quality of somewhere used for exactly this kind of night. Bare table, laptops, a wall where someone had taped up printed documents with the specific disorganization of people moving fast. Croft was there. Benner. Two others whose names she hadn't gotten yet. Victor Kane was not there, and his absence in this room was as loud as a statement. They worked through what they had for 40 minutes. Sienna sat at the corner of the table and read everything they put in front of her without being asked, without explaining herself, because this was not the moment to establish credentials, and anyone who needed credentials before listening to an idea was someone she'd already written off. The calls to Webb. There were 3 recorded attempts to contact Agent Curtis Webb's personal line in the last 2 weeks. One originated from a burner phone purchased in the Aldridge Financial District. One from a payphone, which nobody under 60 used anymore, which meant the choice was deliberate. The third one had a longer routing trace. She leaned over the laptop. "This routing," she said to the man running the trace, young, 20-something, efficient. "Can you pull the originating tower?" He pulled it. The tower was 3 blocks from the Viscari building. The room went quiet. "That doesn't confirm it originated inside," Damien said. He was standing at the other end of the table, and his voice was level in the way it was level when something was costing him a significant amount of control to keep level. "No," she said. "But it narrows the circle." Croft looked at Damien. Something passed between them, 11 years of working together compressing into a look that Sienna couldn't fully read but could feel. The specific gravity of 2 people arriving at the same conclusion they'd both been avoiding. "Where's Victor?" Sienna said. Silence. "Where is he right now, tonight?" she said. "He said he had a personal matter," Croft said. "He checked out at 8. On the same night Marcus was taken." Nobody said anything. Damien turned away from the table and stood with his back to the room for a moment, his hands at his sides, and she watched the tension move through his shoulders like weather. Then he turned back and his face was set in a particular way. Not shut down, not cold exactly, more like something had been decided under the surface and now the surface was just waiting to catch up. "Find him," he said. They found Victor at 1 a.m. Not at his apartment. Not at any of the locations his usual patterns would have predicted. They found him, eventually, through a trace on his car, a black SUV, company vehicle, parked in the underground structure of a hotel called the Benmore in the western part of the city. A hotel that, when Croft ran it, came back connected to a shell company that came back, one step further, connected to an investment group that shared a registered address with 2 other entities, one of which had received capital from a source that matched the financial signature of Garrett Foss's operation. Sienna sat with the chain of connections in front of her and felt the specific sick clarity that comes from a pattern revealing itself completely. Not one connection, not 2. A chain that had been constructed deliberately, with enough intermediaries to survive casual scrutiny, but not this scrutiny, not someone who'd been trained to read financial architecture. She printed the chain on the room's printer and laid it flat on the table. "This isn't recent," she said. "This structure, the shell company, the registered address, this is at least 3 years old. You'd need that long to build it, so it was insulated from surface checks." She looked at Damien. "Victor didn't start working against you this month. He's been building the exit for 3 years. Maybe longer." Damien stood very still. 3 years ago," Croft said slowly, "is when the Aldridge contract shifted. When we lost the—" "Yes," Damien said. Quiet. Final. She watched him absorb it. The 11 years, the infrastructure Victor had built. The things Damien had trusted him with over a decade. She thought about what it felt like to discover that the architecture of your professional life, the person standing closest to you in every room, had been working against the structure while appearing to support it. She thought about her father, discovering the same thing too late, in a different context with different stakes, and still arriving at the same outcome. The thought hit her before she could deflect it, and she put it away because this was not the moment. "We need to move now," she said. "If Victor knows we've identified the pattern, and if he's been operating for 3 years, he may have contingencies for exactly this scenario. Then every hour we wait is an hour he has to change Marcus's location." Damien looked at her. "They'll move him," she said. "Once they know the leverage is compromised, they'll either use it fast or they'll cut it. We can't let them get to either option." He made 2 calls. Quick. The room reorganized itself in the way she was learning it did when a decision had been made. the specific shift from analysis to movement. She was already looking for her jacket when Damien said, "You're staying here." She turned. "Sienna." His voice was even. "You're not—" "Don't," she said. "This is not a function or a gala. People are going to get—" "That's my brother," she said, and the sentence came out clean and hard without heat, because heat was for situations that still had room for emotion, and this one had run out of room. "I have sat in that room and read your documents and built the chain that found Victor in the first place. I am not sitting in a building while someone decides whether my brother is useful anymore. If you want me to stay here, put it in the contract. Otherwise, I'm coming." The room was very quiet. Damien looked at her for a long moment. She held it. "Stay behind the line unless I say," he said. "Non-negotiable." "Understood." He moved, and she moved, and the night swallowed them. The Benmore Hotel's underground structure was 4 levels deep, built in the 1970s when the city had ambitions about a different kind of density and then run out of money before the ambitions resolved. The lower 2 levels were accessed by a service elevator that Damien's people had already mapped on the drive over. Someone in this organization had someone in most city buildings, she was learning, the deep low-level presence of a network that had been built over decades and ran on relationships nobody wrote down. They went in at 2:17 a.m. She stayed where she'd agreed to stay, a position at the stairwell entry on level 2, one of Damien's men beside her, able to see the main corridor but not in the direct line of whatever was about to happen on level 3. She could hear the movement below it, controlled, professional, the kind of sound that was deliberately minimized, which meant she mostly heard its absence rather than the sound itself. Then she heard Victor's voice. Not the words, just the cadence, 2 floors down, carrying up the concrete stairwell in a way the building's architect probably hadn't intended. The tone of it was wrong, too elevated. The voice of a man who'd just realized the calculation he'd been running was off. Then silence. Then Damien's voice, 1 level below, saying something she couldn't make out. Then nothing. She waited. The man beside her, Reyes, didn't speak or move, just held his position with the stillness of someone who'd done this before. 11 minutes later, Damien came up the stairwell. Victor came up behind him, in the grip of Croft and another man, his hands zip-tied in front of him. His face was the face of someone who'd run through several options and arrived at a version of composure that was mostly just what was left when everything else had collapsed. He looked at Sienna as he came up. She looked back. She had expected to feel something specific when she saw him. The satisfaction of a conclusion, maybe, or the cold satisfaction of a problem identified. What she actually felt was something more complicated. The recognition of a man who had spent 11 years in a particular performance and was now standing in the backstage of it, the set taken down around him. She thought about her father again. She pushed it down. They went back to the building near the port. Victor sat in a chair in a room with concrete walls and a single overhead light, and Damien sat across from him, and Sienna stood to one side where she could see both of their faces. Victor didn't speak first. He waited. That was notable. Even now, caught, zip-tied, the machinery dismantled around him, he had enough operational discipline to wait and see what he was being asked rather than volunteer anything. 11 years had made him very good at this. Damien said, "Marcus Hartwell, where is he?" Victor said, "I want a deal on the table before I say anything." "You don't have leverage for a deal." "I have 11 years of information. I have names, dates, financial structures. I have enough to take apart everything you've built and rebuild it as something that puts you in a federal cell for the rest of your life." He said it without heat, accounting, not threat. "So yes, I have leverage." Damien looked at him. "The boy first." "Deal first." "Victor." Damien's voice was extremely quiet. "I'm going to ask you one more time where the boy is, and then the conversation is going to change into something neither of us wants." Victor looked at him for a long moment. Whatever he found in Damien's face made a small muscle at the corner of his jaw move. "Warehouse on the Crestline Road Junction," he said. "Pier 7 Access Road. 2 men. They have instructions not to harm him unless they receive a specific call from me." He paused. "If that call doesn't come by 4 a.m., those instructions change." Sienna was already looking at Damien. He said one word to Croft. Go. Croft and two others left the room. Sienna tracked the time on her phone. 3:11 a.m., 49 minutes. She looked at Victor. The Hartwell debt, she said. Victor's eyes moved to her. He'd been mostly ignoring her, or performing ignoring, which wasn't the same thing. My father, she said. The debt that destroyed my family, the informal creditors, the framing that preceded all of it. She held his gaze. You built that, or you were part of building it. Something moved across his face. Your father, Victor said, found something he was never meant to find. The room changed temperature. He found a series of financial transactions, Victor said, moving through a structure that connected 7 public officials and 4 private businessmen, a structure that had been operating for 9 years. He was an accountant hired to do a routine audit for one of the peripheral entities, and he was too good at his job. He paused. He didn't go to the authorities immediately. He sat on it for 3 weeks. That was enough time for the people involved to identify him, document his personal debt exposure, and make sure he was too compromised to be credible as a witness. Sienna stood very still. Who built the structure? She said. Several people. Who ran it? Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Damien. And the look was not the look of a man revealing a secret. It was the look of a man deploying a final weapon. Ask him, Victor said. The room. Sienna turned her head. Damien's face was doing something she had never seen it do in 3 weeks of watching him closely. It was not controlled. Not in the usual way. There was something in it that looked like the stage before controlled. The stage before a person decides how to present something they haven't decided yet. Damien, she said. He looked at her. What does he mean? Damien said nothing for 3 seconds. The 3 seconds had weight. The structure Victor is describing, he said, I discovered it 4 years ago. I've been using the evidence of it as leverage against the people involved. He paused. I did not build it. I did not run it. But I've been holding it instead of dismantling it, because dismantling it had costs I wasn't prepared to pay. She looked at him. She thought about what he'd said to her on her porch. Nothing I've said is false. She thought about what he hadn't said. My father, she said. The people who destroyed my father. You knew who they were. Yes. For 4 years. Yes. And you used that knowledge as leverage instead of, yes. The word landed and neither of them moved. She thought about her mother in the kitchen, moving cups. She thought about Marcus's bruises. She thought about her father's face at the end when the debt had become something physical in the way it pressed him down. She thought about $140 for a harbor scene painting that matched nothing. The debt, she said. Her voice was level in a way that cost her something she could feel physically, a tightening across her chest that she managed because the alternative was something she couldn't afford right now. The creditors who came after us after he died, were they connected to the same structure? Damien held her gaze. Some of them, yes. Victor watched this from his chair with the expression of a man who has detonated something and is now observing the blast radius. He wasn't enjoying it. That was the thing that was strange. He just looked tired. She turned away from both of them. She stood facing the concrete wall and she breathed, in, out, the mechanical kind, and she assembled the shape of what she'd just learned. Her father had not simply been unlucky. He had not simply been in debt. He had stumbled into the edge of a machine, and the machine had eaten him, and the man she had married, the man she had signed 42 pages with and said legal words to in a city hall room, had known about the machine for 4 years and had chosen to use it as a tool rather than as a reason. She turned back. If I walk out of this building tonight, she said, with my brother, and I go back to Carver Street, and I take my mother and I. Victor's people are still active, Damien said. Outside of this. The task force, the individuals who ran the original structure. They know about you now. They used Marcus because you're connected to me. Walking away from the arrangement doesn't make that connection invisible. She looked at him. You're telling me I can't leave. I'm telling you that leaving doesn't make you safe. It makes you separated from the resources that can make you safe. And you're the resource. Yes. She held his gaze for a long time. She thought about the contract. the 42 pages, the clause she'd crossed out on page 31, and the two she'd revised. She thought about the version of herself who had negotiated those clauses with the conviction that documents could contain situations. She thought about her father, who had also believed that. Then we have a different problem, she said, because the trust this required, the specific trust of not knowing what you knew and believed I deserved to know, that's gone. And you need me functional, which means you need to give me a reason to stay that isn't just the threat of what happens if I go. Damien looked at her. What do you need? He said. She picked up her phone, checked the time, 3:28 a.m. I need my brother in this room in the next 32 minutes, she said. Then I need every document, every piece of evidence, every financial record connected to the structure that killed my father. Everything. Not a summary. Everything. She met his eyes. And then I need you to tell me the plan. The real one. Not the arrangement, not the contract. What you actually intend to do with all of it. The room was very quiet. Because if the plan is to keep using it as leverage, she said, then we are done. All of it. Done. And you can manage Victor and the task force and Foss and everything else without me. She let that sit for 1 second. But if the plan is to end it, to take apart the machine that killed my father and put the people inside it somewhere they can't build another one, then I will help you do that. Every skill I have, everything I've watched and learned in 3 weeks in your world. She paused. Choose. Damien looked at her for the longest moment she'd experienced in his company, and in it she saw something move through his face that wasn't calculation and wasn't performance. Something that looked underneath the architecture of everything he'd built to contain it, like the specific exhaustion of a man who had been deciding alone for a very long time and had arrived at the edge of... Damien said, "End it." The two words came out without ceremony, without the pause she'd been bracing for, without the calculation she'd learned to watch for in the set of his jaw before he spoke. Just the words, flat and final, and behind them something that had been under pressure for a long time, releasing into the room like a pressure valve giving. Every piece of evidence I have, he said, every record, the financial architecture, the names, the transactions going back 9 years, all of it. We use it to take the machine apart. He held her gaze. That was always the intention. I was waiting until I could do it in a way that didn't get both of us killed in the process. And now Victor has accelerated the timeline, he said, which means we work with what we have. She looked at him for a moment longer. She was looking for the version of this that was still calculation, the performance of a decision made for strategic rather than honest reasons. She didn't find it. She found something that looked like a man who had been holding a position alone for a long time and had arrived at the point where the position was no longer sustainable. She didn't know if that was enough. She wasn't sure it had to be, not tonight. Okay, she said. At 3:47 a.m., Croft came back through the door with Marcus. Marcus was unhurt, shaken in the way people are shaken when their body has processed a significant fear and hasn't metabolized it yet. Slightly too still, slightly too careful in his movements, the specific careful of someone who has been held in a place without control and is relearning how their limbs work in open space. His wrists had marks from the zip ties. His face, when he saw Sienna, did something complicated that moved through several things fast and landed somewhere that wasn't quite relief, because relief required the danger to be over, and Marcus was smart enough to know it wasn't. She crossed the room and put her arms around him and held on, and he held back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, into her shoulder, "I'm going to need someone to explain what is happening." "Later," she said. "Sienna, I know, later. Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you sure?" "Yes." A pause. The tape on my mouth left a rash. She let out something that wasn't quite a laugh. She pulled back and looked at his face. The marks, the exhaustion, the residue of a night that would take longer than a night to leave him. And she made herself record it and set it aside, because the anger it produced was real and useful, but not right now. She looked at Damien. "Get him somewhere safe," she said. "Not here, not the building. Somewhere nobody connects to the network." Damien nodded once. "Done." Marcus looked at Damien with an expression that contained a significant number of things he was saving for a different conversation. Then he looked at his sister. "We're going to talk." "We are," she said. "Go, Emnet." They worked through what remained of the night and into the thin gray morning. The documents Damien had described were real. He had Croft bring them, encrypted files, printed records in 2 locked cases, the kind of documentation that had been assembled by someone who understood that the value of evidence was in its completeness rather than its drama. Names Sienna recognized from the financial architecture Victor had partially described. Names she recognized from the gala, the councilman at table 9. Paul Oates, the developer with the nervous eyes. 3 others she hadn't met but could place in the network from the transaction records. And the financial structure itself, 9 years of layered movement, the shell companies, the capital flows, the audit trails that her father had found because he'd been doing his job correctly. She sat with the records for 2 hours and built the map that her father had been building when the machine had noticed him and responded. She could see exactly where he'd been when they'd found him. Transaction Cluster 14, third-tier shell entity, a routing pattern that only appeared anomalous if you were looking at the right subset of dates. He had been looking at exactly the right subset of dates. She sat with that for a moment. Then she kept working. At 7 in the morning, Damien came and stood behind her and looked at what she'd assembled on the table. The chain, laid out in order, with annotations in her handwriting in the margins. "This is complete," he said. "It's comprehensive enough," she said. "There are gaps in the third-tier structure, but the primary network is fully documented. Any competent federal financial crime prosecutor could work with this. Victor knows we have it. Victor is in a concrete room with zip ties," she said. "His leverage is conditional on him being free to exercise it. His contacts aren't." She looked up. "Foss? And the officials. If Victor had a contingency, a dead man's switch, something automated that releases what he knows if he doesn't check in, then we have a limited window before the other side of this starts moving." She thought about that. Did he have that kind of operational sophistication? 11 years, yes. She looked at the table, the map. 9 years of a machine that had eaten her father and had been eating pieces of Damien's operation and was now aware that someone had their hands on the controls. "Then we need to move before they do," she said. "Today." "This morning," he said. She stood up and looked at him across the table, and in the morning light coming through the high windows of the port building, he looked like what he was, a man who had been awake for 30 hours, carrying the specific weight of a betrayal that had been 11 years in the building, standing in front of something that needed to be finished. She thought about the version of the conversation she'd had with him 4 hours ago, and the word he'd said, "End it," and the thing it had cost him to say it. "What do you need me to do?" she said. The plan had 4 components, and it moved fast because fast was the only option left. Sienna's part was the one that required what she had, which was a face nobody in the target network associated with the Vescari operation yet. She was 3 weeks into a contract marriage, not a decade into an organized crime infrastructure. To the people they were moving against, she was still a name in a file, a young woman from Carver Street, recently acquired, publicly irrelevant. That was the asset. She had one meeting, the councilman. His name was Gerald Farrow, and she'd watched him sweat through his collar at table 9, and she'd read his financial connection in the records, and she knew from the documents that he was the most exposed of the public officials in the network, and therefore the most likely to break under the right pressure before the others could get to him. She went alone. This was not in any plan anyone had explicitly stated. It was the conclusion of a logic she'd run through herself and arrived at without asking permission, because asking permission for the right move in a time-compressed situation was a luxury that the situation had already eliminated. She called Farrow's City Hall office at 8:30 in the morning. His aide answered. She gave a name, not her own, a name from the records, a name that belonged to one of the shell entities, and that Farrow would recognize immediately as a signal that whoever was calling knew what they knew. Farrow picked up in 40 seconds. "Who is this?" he said. "My name is Sienna Hartwell Vescari," she said. "I have a complete map of the financial structure running through entities including Lakeview Capital Partners, the Aldridge Development Fund, and 7 others that I can name in order. I have transaction records going back 9 years, including your name attached to specific routing decisions made in April and October of 2019. She paused. You have two options. The first is that you spend today calling lawyers and trying to contain something that is already in motion. The second is that you call a federal financial crimes prosecutor named Ellen Roth at the Eastern District Office. Tell her you want to discuss a voluntary cooperation arrangement, and do it before the people you've been working with decide that your silence is worth more purchase than your cooperation. Silence on the line. Who sent you? Pharaoh said. Nobody sent me, she said. I'm the daughter of Thomas Hartwell. Look that name up in whatever records you've been managing and think about what you did to him and decide whether you want the same outcome. She ended the call. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this with a faint surprise and then filed it. The storm came in off the harbor at noon. Blackridge got storms that moved fast, weather systems that built over the water and hit the coast with the compact violence of something that had been accumulating momentum for 100 miles with nothing to slow it down. This one arrived ahead of any forecast, gray and fast and immediately serious, the harbor turning the color of iron under a sky that compressed toward the waterfront like a ceiling dropping. The shipping yards on the eastern edge of the port district were already half abandoned at noon on a Thursday. Corrugated structures, rusted cranes, the kind of industrial graveyard that a city produces when its maritime economy shifts away from physical goods. Pier 7's access road was a strip of cracked asphalt that ran between two warehouses and dead-ended at the water. This was where Foss's people had taken Marcus. This was also where, at 12:40 in the afternoon, the situation reorganized itself into something nobody had planned for. Damien had moved with Croft and 6 others toward the network's financial holding point, a building in the financial district where the records that mirrored the evidence Sienna had mapped were kept, the records that needed to be either secured or destroyed before the other side could sanitize the trail. That was the primary target. The pier was supposed to be cleared, Marcus already extracted, manageable. Sienna was in a car 2 blocks from the financial district when Reyes, beside her, got a call, and his face did the thing faces do when information arrives that changes the weight of a room. What? She said. Foss is at the pier, Reyes said. He wasn't supposed to be in the city. He came in this morning, 2 vehicles, 6 men. He looked at her. Damien's team is split. He can't redirect without leaving the financial building exposed. She was already calculating. How many do we have here? 3, including me. She thought about Marcus. She thought about Foss, a man she knew from documents and photographs and the operational profile Damien had described, a man who ran the Northern Corridor operation with the specific ruthlessness of someone who had survived long enough in a violent industry to have lost most of his hesitations. She thought about 6 men and a pier and a warehouse and a storm coming in off the harbor. She thought about her father not hesitating when he found the transactions because his job was to look at what was true, regardless of what it cost. Drive, she said. Potem. The pier in the storm was a different geography from the pier in any other weather. The wind off the harbor hit the corrugated walls of the warehouses and produced a sound like continuous low-grade impact. Rain came in sideways, the same as it had on Carver Street weeks ago, and the cranes above the structures moved in the wind with a slow mechanical groan that put a person's teeth on edge. Sienna went in through the east side access, a loading door that Reyes got open with something from a kit he carried without explaining, and they moved through the structure fast and low. She was not armed. She had not been trained for this. What she had was the map of the building from the records she'd read the previous night, which included a layout attached to a property document from 7 years ago, and the specific clarity of mind that comes from a situation where there are no longer any options that feel safe, which means the question becomes not what's safe, but what's necessary. She could hear voices in the interior, not words, just the cadence of a conversation happening in a large space, echoing off concrete and steel, directional enough to navigate by. She found Marcus in the 3rd room. He was on his feet, which was the first thing she assessed. Standing, not restrained. They'd cut the zip ties, which meant something about the current status of the situation that she didn't have enough information to fully interpret. He was against the far wall, and across from him, between him and the door, was a man she recognized from the surveillance photographs as one of Foss's operational people. The man had his back to her. Behind her, Reyes said nothing. She held up a hand. "Stay." She walked into the room. The man turned. He had a gun in his right hand, not raised, held in the way of someone maintaining a situation rather than actively managing a threat. He looked at her, and his face moved through several things in fast sequence. Surprise, assessment, a rapid recalculation. "Who are you?" he said. "I'm his sister," she said. "Get against the wall." "I'm not going to do that," she said. "What I'm going to do is tell you that the financial structure this operation runs through is currently being documented and transmitted to federal prosecutors, and the people who've been running this network are in the process of making arrangements that don't include the people they deployed in the field." She said it at a normal conversational volume, without urgency, the way she'd sat across from Victor Kane at the gala and said things into the space of the room. "Which means you need to decide very quickly whether being here is still something that benefits you." The man looked at her. "You're stalling," he said. "I'm also telling the truth," she said. "Both things can be true." From somewhere deeper in the structure there was a sound. Fast, sequential, the specific acoustic signature of a door being breached at speed. Then voices, multiple, with the particular compression of urgency. The man's eyes moved to the door behind her. That was the moment. Marcus moved first, off the wall, across the space, his shoulder hitting the man at waist height with the momentum of 18 years of stored anger at everything that had happened to his family, which was not insignificant. The gun clattered on the concrete. Sienna crossed the room and kicked it away before anyone could get to it, and then Reyes was through the door and the man was on the floor, and Marcus was breathing like he'd run a mile and looking at his hands like he was checking they still worked. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No." He looked at her. "You came back." "I told you I would." "You didn't tell me that." "I would have," she said. "Come on." What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of compressed, multi-location chaos that reconstructs itself clearly only afterward, in retrospect, when the pieces can be laid alongside each other and the shape of the whole becomes visible. In the moment it was fragmented and loud and cold, the storm working itself into full intensity, rain coming down in sheets that turned the pier road into a running stream and reduced visibility to 30 feet. Damien's team secured the financial building. The records were intact. Foss's people had been moving toward them, but hadn't reached them, delayed by the timeline shifting when Foss diverted to the pier. Croft transmitted what was needed. The chain from Sienna's mapping, combined with the primary records, was now in the hands of two independent parties who were not the Viscari operation. Foss himself was at the pier. She saw him for the first time in person when she came out of the warehouse with Marcus and Reyes, and 3 of Foss's people were in the access road between them and the vehicles. And behind them, standing in the rain at the entrance of the second warehouse, was a man in his 50s with gray at his temples and the specific physical stillness of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous person in a given space. He looked at her. She looked back. "Viscari's wife," he said. Not a question. "Hartwell," she said. "Your father found something he shouldn't have." "He found what was there to find," she said. "That's not the same thing." Foss looked at her for a moment with something that might have been, in a different life, appreciation. Then he looked at the 3 men between them and made a small motion with his hand, and they moved. Not toward her, but repositioning, flanking, the motion of people preparing. Her phone rang. It was Damien. She picked up. "Where are you?" he said. "Pier 7 Access Road. Foss is here. He's got—" "I know. Don't move. 30 seconds. She kept the phone to her ear and looked at Foss, and Foss looked at her, and the rain came down between them, and the wind moved through the cranes above the warehouses with a sound like the structure of things groaning under load. Then the vehicles came down the access road. 3 of them, moving fast, headlights cutting through the rain, and Damien was out of the lead vehicle before it stopped, the door swinging open while the wheels were still finding their stop, and he crossed the distance between the vehicle and where Sienna stood in a way that contained no wasted motion at all. He looked at her once, a look that lasted less than a second but covered significant ground, and then he looked at Foss. "Garrett," he said. "Damien," Foss said. The access road was very still for a moment in the way that spaces become still when the people in them are running calculations simultaneously. Victor is in custody, Damien said. The financial records are transmitted. The councilman called Ellen Roth's office at 9:15 this morning. He paused. It's done, Garrett. The structure is gone. Foss stood in the rain and his face did something controlled and thorough, the face of a man absorbing a strategic catastrophe and deciding in real time what his options were. She watched him and thought about the calculation, put herself in it. The network gone, the records out, cooperation already initiated by the most exposed member. The math was specific and it was bad, and Foss was smart enough to know it. You've been building to this, Foss said. Yes. The marriage, the wife, the visibility. Foss's eyes moved to Sienna, briefly. She was the trigger. She was the reason, Damien said, and the way he said it was not strategic and not performed, and Sienna heard it and kept her face where it was. Foss looked at the vehicles behind Damien. He looked at his 3 men. He ran the number, and the number came back, and whatever it came back as made something in his posture shift. A degree. No more. The shift of a man stepping back from a line rather than crossing it. You'll have lawyers on me by morning, he said. Federal lawyers, Damien said. Not mine. A pause. That's supposed to reassure me. It's supposed to tell you I'm not interested in what happens to you personally, Damien said. I'm interested in the structure being gone. Foss stood in the rain for another moment. His men looked at him. He didn't look at them. His eyes stayed on Damien, running whatever final calculation a man runs when he's standing in a flooded access road next to a harbor in a storm, and the architecture of 11 years has come down in a single morning. Then he said something to his men that Sienna couldn't hear over the rain, and they moved, and Foss turned and walked back toward his vehicles without another word, and the pier access road was left to the storm and the 4 of them, and the weight of everything that had happened in the preceding 8 hours. Marcus stood at her left shoulder. She could hear him breathing. She reached back and put her hand briefly on his arm. Not a gesture, just contact, just confirming something without words. And he put his hand over hers for a second, and then they both let go. Damien turned from watching Foss's vehicles leave and looked at her. She looked back at him. His face in the rain was undone in the specific way of someone who has stopped managing the surface because the situation has finally moved past the stage where management was required. And what was underneath the management was not easy or resolved. It was complicated and tired and something else she couldn't name from this distance. Pharaoh called Roth, she said. I know. The records are transmitted. I know. Victor's contingency. We got to it before it triggered, he said. Croft found it at 6 this morning. She absorbed that. You knew about the contingency. I suspected. And you let me make the call to Pharaoh anyway. You didn't ask my permission, he said. No, she said. I didn't. He looked at her for a moment in the rain, and something moved across his face that had no strategic purpose at all. Then, from the second warehouse, there was a sound. A steel structure shifting in the wind, a groan of metal under load. The specific acoustic warning of something that had been holding under pressure and was now... The sound was not subtle. It started as a groan, the low structural kind that a building makes when something load-bearing has been compromised, and the compromise has been ongoing long enough that the building has been making small adjustments and has finally run out of adjustments to make. Then it became something faster, a sequential collapse of lateral supports, and the east wall of the second warehouse began to come apart from the top down, in a cascading failure that sent corrugated steel panels sheeting outward into the access road. Damien moved before Sienna had fully processed the sound. His hand caught her arm and pulled, and she was running. Marcus already running to her left, Reyes to her right, and the panels came down behind them with a series of impacts that she felt through the ground in her feet, each one heavy and final, the sound of things that had been pretending to hold, letting go all at once. They cleared the access road as the east wall finished its collapse into the space they'd been standing in. The rain came down into the open structure. The cranes above shifted and held. They stood at the end of the access road in the driving rain, all of them breathing hard. And for a moment no one said anything. Marcus had his hands on his knees. Reyes was looking back at the collapsed wall with an expression that was trying to decide between professional assessment and something more personal. Damien had let go of her arm but was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the cold rain, and she didn't move away from it. "Everyone," Damien said, not loud. "Yes," she said. Marcus straightened. "Yeah." Reyes nodded. Damien looked at the collapsed warehouse for a moment. Then he looked at the sky. The storm at full press, gray and low and moving fast over the harbor. And he said, "Let's go." They went. Well, the debrief, such as it was, happened not in the port building, but in a conference room on the 8th floor of a building in the financial district that Damien's lawyer maintained for exactly the kind of meeting that couldn't happen in an office connected to anything traceable. Ellen Roth's office had already been in contact. Pharaoh's cooperation had been formally initiated at 10:43 in the morning. The financial records Sienna had mapped and Croft had transmitted were in the hands of a federal financial crimes unit by early afternoon. Victor Kane was transferred to federal custody at 2 p.m. Sienna sat in the conference room with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking and the documents she'd been working from spread on the table in front of her. And she looked at the name at the top of the chain, her own annotation, in her own handwriting, in the margin of a transaction record from 2019, T. Hartwell. Entry point, Cluster 14. She looked at it for a long time. Damien came and sat across from her. Not beside her. Across, where she could see his face. She thought that was deliberate, and she was right. "The people who ran the original structure," she said. "Pharaoh is the most exposed. Who are the others?" "Two are already represented by lawyers who've been making calls this morning," he said. "The third, Oates, the developer. His assistant reported him unreachable at 9 a.m. By noon, his car was found at the airport. He ran. He ran to a country that has a complicated extradition history with this one," Damien said. "He may stay gone for a while." She absorbed that. The imperfection of it. The machine partly dismantled, most of its operators caught or compromised, one escaped. She'd known, in the abstract, that the outcome would not be total. Outcomes were never total. But knowing it abstractly and sitting with the specific face of Paul Oates in her mind and understanding that he was somewhere without consequence was a different experience than the abstraction. "The evidence is enough without him," Damien said. Roth's team confirmed that. "The chain is complete enough that Oates is a secondary target, not a necessary one." "That's a legal answer," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at the table. "My father found the cluster on a Tuesday. I found the same notation in his work calendar, in his files after he died. I didn't know what it meant at the time. Cluster 14, he wrote, ? She paused. "He came home from work that Tuesday and made dinner and didn't say anything to my mother. She told me later he'd seemed distracted. 3 weeks later, the first creditor letters arrived." Damien said nothing. "He knew what he'd found," she said, and he still didn't run. He went back to work and he kept doing his job, and he waited too long to understand that the people who'd noticed him were going to move faster than he would." She looked up. "He trusted the system. He thought what he'd found was the kind of thing that could be handled through the right channels." "It wasn't," Damien said. "No," she said. "It wasn't. The right channels were the people he'd found." She picked up the coffee. It was cold. She drank some of it anyway. "You found it 4 years ago," she said. "Yes." "And you held it because using it outright, going to any authority with it, would have exposed you as the source." "Yes." "Because the things you'd done to accumulate the leverage you used to survive in the same network that killed my father were themselves things that authorities would have been interested in." He held her gaze. "Yes." She set the cup down. "So you've been sitting on the evidence of my father's destruction for 4 years because dismantling the machine would have dismantled you in the process." "That's accurate?" She looked at him for a long time. The conference room was quiet. Outside, through the high windows, the storm was beginning to break. The rain still coming, but the sky lightening at the edges in the west. The particular quality of afternoon light that comes through the back end of a storm. "I'm not going to tell you I've resolved that," she said. "I haven't. I probably won't for a long time." "I know. But I'm also not going to pretend it's the only true thing," she said. You could have kept holding it. Instead, you used it. That's something. She paused. Not everything, but something. He looked at her across the table, and what was in his face was not relief. She'd half expected relief, the release of a thing finally said and acknowledged. But what she found was something more complicated than relief. More like a person standing in a space they'd cleared and looking at what the clearing had cost. Your father, he said, was the reason I started building the case instead of just holding it. His name came up in the records when I pulled the full chain. I recognized it because I'd been looking into your family's situation before I made the offer on Carver Street. He paused. The offer wasn't coincidental. I knew what had happened to him. I knew the connection. She stared at him. You knew before you came to the house, she said. Yes. You knew my father was destroyed by the same machine you were holding evidence against. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. She was recalculating the shape of the last 3 weeks from a different entry point. The man on the porch, the offer, the contract, the 42 pages, the thing she'd taken for strategy acquiring a layer she hadn't seen. Was any of it? She stopped, started again. Was the offer about the evidence, using me, somehow, as a move against the network? No, he said. The offer was about needing what I told you I needed, the effects of a visible, stable arrangement. That was real. He paused. But the reason I chose your family specifically was not random. It was the connection. It was the connection, and the fact that you were... The person in the file was different from what the file usually produces. I'd read about your father's case, and I'd looked at what you'd done since. The job offers you'd turned down. The way you'd managed the situation after his death. He paused. I wasn't wrong about you. That's a very carefully worded thing to say. It's the most honest thing I know how to say right now, he said. I'm aware it's insufficient. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about sufficiency and what it required, and whether the current situation had a standard she could apply. She thought about her father trusting the system and what it had cost him. She thought about the 42 pages she'd signed without trusting anything and what it had produced. Okay, she said finally, quietly, to herself as much as to him. She went to Carver Street in the late afternoon when the storm had passed and the city was doing the thing it did after weather. Wet and clean and slightly changed in the quality of its light, the harbor silver and still. Her mother was in the kitchen, not moving cups. She was cooking, actually cooking, a pot on the stove. The smell of something real in the air. Eleanor Hartwell looked up when Sienna came through the door and looked at her daughter's face and said nothing for a moment, reading it the way mothers read faces. The specific literacy of someone who has watched an expression since it was formed. Marcus called, Eleanor said. Is he here? He's upstairs, he's sleeping. A pause. He told me some of it. How much? Enough. Eleanor turned back to the stove. Sit down. Sienna sat at the kitchen table. The same table she'd sat at the night before she'd made the call, with the folder in front of her and all the numbers that didn't change no matter how many times she ran them. The table looked the same, the kitchen looked the same. The light coming through the window was the same afternoon light that had come through it her entire life. The debt is cleared, Sienna said. I know. The people connected to what happened to Dad, most of them are going to be prosecuted. There's a federal investigation. It's real. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She stirred whatever was in the pot with a slow, deliberate motion. Most of them, she said. One got out. Before they could... Yes, most of them. Eleanor nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing something in the category of things that are imperfect and must be lived with anyway. Your father would have wanted all of them, she said. But your father also would have understood that most of them, in the real world, is what you get if you're lucky. Sienna looked at her mother's back. You knew something was wrong before the end. He must have... He didn't tell me, Eleanor said. He never told me. He was trying to protect us from knowing. She paused. I knew anyway. You can live with someone for 30 years and you know when they're carrying something they're not going to show you. She turned from the stove and looked at her daughter. He should have told me. We could have run. Would you have? Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said. "Probably not. He knew that too. That's why he didn't tell me." A small, complicated thing moved across her face. "We were both too stubborn for our own good." Sienna looked at the table. "The man you married," Eleanor said. "Yes." "Is he... Are you?" She stopped, started differently. "Are you going to be all right?" Sienna thought about the question. She thought about all the ways to answer it, the safe ways, the deflecting ways, the ways that would protect her mother from the complexity of a situation that didn't resolve into simple categories. She thought about her father choosing those ways, and what it had cost all of them. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think so." Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then she turned back to the stove. "Then come help me with this," she said. "It's going to need more time than I thought." Sienna got up and went to stand beside her mother at the stove, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and the kitchen filled with the smell of something being made from scratch, in a house that had almost stopped being theirs. And outside the window, the harbor sat silver and still in the aftermath of the storm. Victor Kane's federal hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. The charges were significant, and the cooperation Farrow had initiated had produced enough corroborating evidence that the case was, in the assessment of the federal prosecutor's office, strong. Sienna read the public filing carefully, the way she read everything, and she found her father's name in a single paragraph, T. Hartwell, independent auditor, whose discovery of the network in 2021 preceded a documented campaign of financial coercion that contributed to his death in 2023. And she sat with that paragraph for a long time. Not because it was wrong. It was accurate. Accurate in the way that legal language is accurate, specific, bounded, describing the shape of a thing without being able to describe the weight of it. She printed the paragraph and folded it and put it in the drawer of the desk in her old room at Carver Street, beside a photograph of her father at the harbor front on a summer afternoon, holding a brush, paint on his hands, grinning at something outside the frame. She didn't know exactly what she was saving it for. She thought she might someday. Boss. The 1-year mark arrived in a way that didn't announce itself. She'd expected it to feel like a conclusion, the way contracts feel when they reach their term, a clean edge, a defined transition. What it felt like instead was a Thursday in autumn, cold off the harbor, the 2nd year of autumn she'd spent in this city, knowing the things she now knew, and she woke up in the suite in the Vescari building and lay there for a moment with the light coming through the high windows, and thought about the shape of the year. The arrangement had done what it was supposed to do. The debt was cleared. Eleanor had stability, genuine stability, a fixed income that came from the settlement Damien's lawyer had formalized, and the house on Carver Street was in her name with the mortgage paid to term. Marcus had finished his first year at City Technical with attendance that his advisor described, in a letter that made Sienna laugh for the first time in weeks, as remarkably improved. He was studying systems engineering. He was, in the careful, provisional way of people who have been through something that reset their understanding of the world, okay? The machine was dismantled. The network that had eaten her father was in federal proceedings. The people who had run it were in various stages of legal consequence, the most dramatic of which was Victor Kane, who had taken a cooperation agreement that reduced his exposure and spent his days talking to federal prosecutors in a room that was not, from any description Sienna had been able to construct, comfortable. Paul Oates remained abroad. She'd made peace with that, in the specific sense of understanding that peace with it was not an available option, and that the absence of resolution was itself something she was going to carry. The divorce papers arrived on a Wednesday. Brell had prepared them, precise, clean, the formal mechanism for ending what they'd started in that City Hall room 11 months earlier. The settlement terms were what had been agreed in the contract, permanent, fair, documented. Sienna sat with the papers on the coffee table in the suite's front room for 2 evenings without signing them. On the 3rd evening, Damien came and sat in the chair across from her and looked at the papers on the table and then at her. "They've been there for 3 days," he said. "I'm aware. Brell needs them back by Friday." "I know when Brell needs them." He was quiet. She looked at the papers. They were good papers, yeah. Thorough, fair, protecting her the way she'd protected herself in the original contract. She'd read them 3 times and found nothing to revise. That wasn't why she hadn't signed. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "The thing you said at the pier, that I was the reason." She looked at him. "What did that mean?" "Precisely." He held her gaze. "You know what it meant." "I want to hear you say it precisely." He looked at her for a moment. The measuring look, the one she'd first seen on her porch in the rain, but different now, without the calculation that had been underneath it then. Something had left his face over the course of a year that she hadn't noticed leaving, degree by degree, the way things change in a relationship when neither person is tracking the change, but the change is real. "It meant," he said, "that I've been deciding things alone for a long time, and that this year I didn't, and that I don't want to go back to doing it the way I did it before." He paused. "It meant that you're the reason I use the evidence instead of continuing to hold it. Not strategy. You." Another pause. "It meant that the contract was about what I told you it was about, and it also became something I didn't put in the contract, and I don't know how to be precise about the second thing except to say that I know what it is." She looked at him. "You kept things from me," she said. "Yes." "Things that were mine to know." "Yes." "That's not something I can just file and move past." "I know." "If this is something," she said, "it has to be different from how it started. Completely different. Not a version of the arrangement with the terms adjusted. Actually different." "What does different look like?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "But it starts with you not deciding alone what I need to know about my own life." He held her gaze. "Agreed." She looked at the papers on the table. She thought about the 42 pages she'd signed 11 months ago in Brell's conference room, looking at the harbor through the 14th floor windows. She thought about the version of herself who'd signed them, the precision of it, the controlled calculation, the certainty that documents could contain situations. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known then, that situations are not containable, that people are not files, that the most important things in any year are always the things that weren't in any contract. She picked up the papers. She looked at them for one more moment. Then she set them down on the table, reached across, and picked up the pen. She signed her name on the line. Damien watched her. She set the pen down. "That's not what I expected," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "The contract is done. I don't want what comes next to be another contract." She looked at him. "I want it to be a choice. A real one. Made without debt or leverage or someone else's timeline." She paused. "I need some time to make it from there." He looked at her for a long moment. In the year she'd spent learning how to read his face, she'd become fluent in its smaller languages, the fractional adjustments, the things that moved behind his eyes before they reached his expression. What was in his face now was not strategy and not performance, and not the controlled patience of a man waiting for a useful outcome. It was the specific, undefended look of someone who has decided to want something and is not yet sure whether they will get it. "Okay," he said. "I'm going back to Carver Street for a while," she said. "My mother needs, and I need, some distance from all of this to figure out which parts are mine and which parts were the circumstances." "How long?" "I don't know." He nodded, the nod of someone accepting something that has no clean edge. She stood up. She picked up the signed papers. At the door of the front room, she stopped and turned back, because there was one more thing, and she'd decided weeks ago that she wasn't her father. She wasn't going to carry a thing unsaid to protect someone from knowing it. "The harbor painting," she said. He looked at her. "The one my father bought at the street fair. Ugly, doesn't match anything, harbor scene in colors that shouldn't work together." She paused. "I sold it for $140 to cover a utility bill. Last month I found it. The gallery that bought it had it in their back inventory. It wasn't expensive." She stopped. "I bought it back." He waited. "It's hanging in the kitchen at Carver Street," she said. "My mother cried for about 30 seconds and then told me the colors were still wrong." A pause. "I just wanted you to know that some things can be recovered. Some things that you think are just gone can be found again." She looked at him. "I'm not saying that as a metaphor. I'm saying it because it's true. and because I think you're someone who needs to hear true things." He looked at her across the front room, and the thing in his face was quiet and real, and not for anyone else's consumption. And she held it for a moment, and then she let it go, and she left. But months passed the way months do after a storm. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular texture of time that has been through something and is integrating it. The way a body integrates an injury, the healed place always slightly different in density from what surrounds it. Marcus graduated to his second year. He came home on weekends sometimes and sat at the kitchen table with coffee and talked to his sister and his mother in the way he hadn't talked in years. Present, unguarded, the carefully constructed armor of a year of bracing for impact, finally coming down in pieces. He still flinched sometimes, slightly, at sudden sounds. He'd probably do that for a while. He knew it, and so did she, and neither of them made it into something. Eleanor Hartwell bought new curtains for the front room. This was the first discretionary purchase she'd made in 4 years, and she spent an unreasonable amount of time deciding on the color and chose something close to the colors in the harbor painting, which she'd moved to the front room because the kitchen, she'd decided, needed something different. The harbor painting went above the mantel and looked, in that position, less like an ugly harbor scene and more like something someone had specifically chosen to put there. Sienna went back to work, not to corporate consulting. She'd made her peace with the fact that that window had closed in the specific way that windows close when life moves faster than career plans. She took a position with a financial forensics firm, the kind of practice that worked with law enforcement and prosecutors on economic crime cases. Her first week, she sat in a briefing about a financial structure that had been using shell entities to route capital across multiple jurisdictions, and she looked at the diagram on the screen and had the specific sensation of someone who has learned a language from necessity and is now being asked to teach it. She was good at it. She'd always been going to be good at it. It had taken the year to produce the conditions in which she found out. She called Damien on a Tuesday evening in the late winter, standing in the kitchen at Carver Street, the harbor painting above the mantel in the front room visible from where she stood. She called the number she'd memorized, which was the personal line, not the card. He picked up on the second ring. She said, "I've been thinking about what comes next." A pause. And I want to have a conversation, a real one, without papers and without outcomes already decided. She paused. "Dinner. Somewhere that isn't connected to anything. Just a place." A silence that lasted several seconds. "There's a restaurant on the harbor," he said. "The old one near Pier 3. Nothing to do with anyone I know." "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he said. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked out the window at the city in the winter dark. Blackridge in the cold, the harbor somewhere beyond the rooftops, the lights coming on in windows across the street. She thought about a yellow notice on a front gate. She thought about black SUVs in the rain. She thought about 42 pages and the things they hadn't contained. She thought about the distance between a transaction and a choice, and the specific terrain that lay between them. All the things that happened in that terrain, the cost of crossing it, the things you learned about yourself in the crossing that you couldn't have learned any other way. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs. Through the window at the top of the stairs, the harbor was dark and still and very far below the city lights, and somewhere out there the water was moving the way it always moved. Indifferent to what had happened on its shores, continuous, carrying things forward whether the people on the land were ready or not. She stood there for a moment. Then she went to bed, and the house was quiet. And outside, the city went on being itself, and Thursday was 2 days away, and she had enough time.